What drives ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil? How does a farmer, a father, a church member wake up one morning and decide that today he is going to help murder an entire wagon train of innocent families? The men who carried out the Mountain Meadows massacre were not outlaws or criminals. They were settlers, community leaders, men who went to church every Sunday and sang hymns. And that makes what they did even more terrifying, because it proves that under the right circumstances, regular people are capable of unspeakable horror. This is the story of how fear and fanaticism turned neighbors into killers. September 1857. The Baker-Fancher wagon train rolled across the Utah Territory, tired but hopeful. They had been traveling for months, starting their journey back in Arkansas in the spring, making their way slowly across the plains and mountains toward California. About 140 people total, men, women, and children, farmers and families seeking better land and new opportunities in the West. They were well supplied and relatively wealthy by frontier standards. Their wagons carried quality goods, fine horses, and a substantial herd of cattle. The men were experienced frontiersmen. The women were strong pioneer stock who had already proven they could handle the hardships of the trail. The children ranged from teenagers down to infants, all of them excited about the adventure ahead, unaware that most of them had less than 2 weeks to live. The train was led by Alexander Fancher, a respected wagon master who had made this journey before. He knew the route, knew the dangers, knew how to keep people safe. Traveling with him were the Bakers and other Arkansas families, people who had sold everything back home to start fresh out west. They were good people, church-going people. They had no enemies, or at least they thought they had no enemies. By early September, they had reached southern Utah Territory. They needed to rest their animals, replenish their water, and buy supplies before tackling the desert crossing that lay ahead. The valley called Mountain Meadows seemed like the perfect place to stop. Good grass for the livestock, a spring providing fresh water, plenty of space to set up camp and let everyone recover from the hard traveling. But they had arrived in Utah Territory at the worst possible time. Tensions between the Mormon settlers and the federal government had reached a breaking point. President Buchanan had sent the United States Army toward Utah to deal with what he saw as Mormon rebellion against federal authority. The Mormon leadership, led by Brigham Young, had declared martial law and ordered their people to prepare for war. The atmosphere throughout Utah Territory was tense, fearful, and increasingly paranoid. Mormon settlers saw enemies everywhere. They had been driven from their homes before, persecuted in Missouri and Illinois, and they were determined it would not happen again. When wagon trains from the east started passing through, some Mormons began to view them not as innocent travelers, but as potential threats, possible spies, maybe even enemies who deserved punishment. The Baker-Fancher train had no idea they were rolling into this powder keg of fear and anger, and they were just families trying to get to California. They stopped at Mormon settlements along the way to buy supplies. Some settlements refused to trade with them. Others were hostile in ways the travelers did not understand. But they kept moving, kept heading south, kept believing that once they got past Utah Territory, everything would be fine. They made camp at Mountain Meadows on September 7th, 1857. The grass was good, the water was clear, the valley was beautiful in the late summer sun. They settled in, let their animals graze, and prepared to rest for a few days before continuing their journey. They had no idea they were being watched. The attack came at dawn on September 7th, 1857. The emigrants were making breakfast, tending to their animals, going about the normal routine of camp life. Then gunfire erupted from the hills surrounding the meadow. Bullets tore through canvas wagon covers. Men grabbed their rifles. Women screamed and pulled children to the ground. Chaos erupted in seconds. The emigrants had no idea who was shooting at them. The attackers were hidden in the rocks and brush on the hillsides, firing down into the camp. Some of the emigrants thought it must be Indians. though this did not make complete sense because Indian attacks in this region were rare, and the local Paiutes had always been relatively peaceful with travelers passing through. Alexander Fancher immediately organized the defense. The men pushed the wagons into a circular formation, creating a barricade. They dug rifle pits beneath the wagons. They used flour sacks and anything else they could pile up to create cover. The women reloaded weapons while the men fired back at their attackers. The children huddled in the center of the circle, terrified, crying, not understanding what was happening or why. The siege had begun, and it would last for 5 days. 5 days of constant fear. 5 days of dwindling water and ammunition. 5 days of desperate hope that somehow help would arrive or the attackers would give up and leave. The emigrants had no way of knowing that help was never coming, that they had been marked for death, and that the men shooting at them from the hills included their own neighbors, Mormon settlers from nearby towns who had decided these travelers needed to be eliminated. The attackers kept up steady fire but did not rush the camp. They stayed hidden in the rocks, shooting whenever anyone moved, making it impossible for the emigrants to get to the spring for water or to retrieve their scattered cattle. A few emigrants were hit in those first hours. A man named William Aden took a bullet in the arm. A teenage boy was grazed across the shoulder. But the circle of wagons held, and the defenders fired back effectively enough to keep their attackers at a distance. By the second day, the situation was getting desperate. The water barrels were nearly empty. The children cried from thirst. The wounded needed care, but there was limited medical supplies. The livestock trapped inside the wagon circle had no water either and were becoming dangerous in their panic. Several men tried to make a run for the spring under cover of darkness, but were driven back by gunfire. The emigrants could not understand what was happening. They had money. They had goods to trade. If this was a robbery attempt, why not just demand the supplies and move on? Why the prolonged siege? What did these attackers want? The answer was something the emigrants could never have imagined: total annihilation. The men in the hills were not trying to rob them or drive them away. They were keeping them pinned down, waiting for the moment when the emigrants would be weak enough, desperate enough, vulnerable enough for the final move. On the third day, some of the attackers were dressed and painted to look like Indians. This was deliberate. The plan had always been to blame this massacre on the Paiutes, to make it look like a tribal attack so no one would suspect the truth. Some actual Paiute warriors had been recruited to participate, told that these emigrants had poisoned their wells or killed their people, our lies designed to secure their help in the attack. The emigrants fought bravely, but they were running out of time and options. By the 5th day, September 11th, they were desperate for water, low on ammunition, exhausted from constant vigilance, and beginning to lose hope that they would survive this nightmare. That was when the white flag appeared on the hill, and men on horseback rode toward the wagon circle, calling out that they had come to help. The men riding toward the wagon circle under that white flag were members of the Mormon militia, the Nauvoo Legion. They were led by John D. Lee, a prominent member of the community, a man with multiple wives and adopted children, someone the emigrants might have seen in settlements they had passed through on their journey south. He called out that he had come to negotiate a truce, to help them escape safely. Inside the wagon circle, there was debate. Some of the men did not trust this. The whole situation felt wrong. Why would rescuers arrive only after 5 days of siege? Why now, when they were at their weakest? But others argued they had no choice. They were out of water. They were nearly out of ammunition. Children were suffering. They had to take this chance or they would all die of thirst anyway. Alexander Fancher agreed to talk. Lee told him that the attackers in the hills were Indians who were furious at the emigrants for some perceived wrong, possibly poisoning a spring or killing cattle that belonged to the tribes. He said the only way to save the emigrants was for them to surrender their weapons and come with the militia under protection. He promised safe passage back to the settlements, and he gave his word as a fellow American, a fellow Christian, that no harm would come to them. It was all lies. Every single word was a lie, designed to get the emigrants to disarm and separate, so they could be killed more easily. But the emigrants, desperate and exhausted, believed him. They wanted to believe that someone had finally come to help, that their nightmare was ending, that they would survive to see California after all. What the emigrants did not know, could not have known, was that days earlier there had been a meeting at a nearby settlement. Mormon leaders had gathered to discuss what to do about this wagon train. The decision made in that meeting was murder. The reasoning was twisted and terrible. They convinced themselves that these emigrants were enemies, that they had threatened or insulted Mormons, that they represented a danger that had to be eliminated completely. Some of the men at that meeting objected. Some argued for letting the wagon train pass, but they were overruled by others who claimed to have authority from higher church leaders, who said that this was necessary to protect their community, that these travelers knew too much about Mormon preparations for war with the federal government, that leaving them alive would bring soldiers and retribution down on all of them. The plan they developed was calculated and cold. Attack the emigrants, make it look like Indians did it, keep them pinned down until they were weak, then approach under false pretenses and disarm them. Once the emigrants were helpless, kill them all. Leave no witnesses except children too young to remember or testify. Blame everything on the Paiutes. Destroy all evidence. Threaten anyone who talked. Make it disappear. Between 50 and 60 Mormon militiamen participated in what came next. These were not strangers or outsiders. These were men from Cedar City, from nearby settlements, farmers and craftsmen and family men. Some of them knew it was wrong even as they prepared to do it. Some of them would later claim they were following orders, that they feared punishment if they refused, that they believed they were acting on instructions from church authorities. But whatever their reasoning, whatever they told themselves to justify it, they were about to become mass murderers. The emigrants agreed to the terms. They would surrender their weapons, leave their wagons and possessions, and walk under militia escort back to the settlements. The wounded would ride in wagons. The children would go first with some of the women. The men would come last, each walking with a militiaman assigned to guard him. It seemed like salvation. It was actually a death march being organized with brutal efficiency. As the emigrants prepared to leave their defensive circle, some of them felt uneasy. The looks on the militiamen's faces were wrong. Too hard, too cold. But what choice did they have? They handed over their weapons. They organized into the groups they had been told to form. They believed they were about to be saved. They walked in organized columns away from the wagon circle. The smallest children went first, riding in wagons with a few women to care for them. Then came the older women and girls, walking in a group. Behind them came the wounded men in another wagon. And finally, at the rear, the able-bodied men, each one walking beside a militiaman who was supposedly there to protect him. The procession stretched out along the trail. The emigrants were unarmed, vulnerable, trusting that the nightmare was finally over. Some of them probably felt relief. Some probably prayed in gratitude. Some might have been planning what they would do when they finally reached California, what they would tell people about this terrifying experience in Utah territory. They had walked about a mile when John D. Lee gave the signal. It was a single word, a prearranged code that every militiaman knew. The word was halt. Everything happened at once. The militiamen walking beside the emigrant men turned and fired point blank into the people they were supposed to be protecting. Men fell, shot in the head, the chest, the back. Some died instantly, and others dropped wounded, crying out in pain and betrayal. The militiamen stood over them and fired again and again until everyone was dead. At the same moment, the attackers who had been hiding in the hills rushed down on the women and older children. What happened next was butchery. The women screamed, they ran, they begged, they tried to shield their children with their own bodies. It made no difference. They were shot, stabbed, clubbed to death. Teenage girls were murdered while crying for mercy. Mothers were killed while holding their babies. Some of the women fought back with their bare hands, clawing at their attackers, trying desperately to protect their children. They were cut down anyway. The killing was frenzied, chaotic, brutal beyond description. The attackers showed no mercy, no hesitation, no humanity. They killed until every woman and every child over the age of about 7 was dead. The massacre took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. 120 people murdered in the time it takes to eat breakfast. Bodies lay scattered along the trail, in the brush, in the wagon. The screaming had stopped. The only sounds were the crying of the small children who had been spared and the heavy breathing of the killers standing over what they had done. Some accounts say that a few militiamen refused to participate when the moment came. Some say certain men stood to the side and did not fire, could not bring themselves to murder defenseless people no matter what orders they had been given. But they did not stop it either. They did not protect the emigrants. They just stood there and let it happen, which made them complicit in the crime, even if they did not personally pull a trigger. The 17 surviving children, all under the age of 7, were crying and confused. They had just watched their parents and siblings murdered in front of them. They were traumatized beyond measure. The militiamen gathered them up, these little witnesses to genocide, and prepared to distribute them among Mormon families who would raise them and teach them lies about how their families died. The bodies were left where they fell. There was talk of burial, but nobody wanted to do the work. Nobody wanted to spend that much time with what they had done. So they threw brush and rocks over some of the corpses and left the rest exposed to the elements and the animals. For months afterward, travelers passing through the area reported seeing bones and clothing scattered across the meadow, skulls with bullet holes, small shoes, remnants of the horror that would haunt this place forever. The militiamen took the wagons, the livestock, the money, the supplies, everything of value. They divided the plunder among themselves, enriching their families with the possessions of the people they had just murdered. Some of them went home and slept that night as if nothing unusual had happened. Some of them probably never slept well again, haunted by what they had done, by the faces they had seen, by the screams they would hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The cover-up had already begun before the last body stopped bleeding. The 17 children who survived ranged in age from about 6 months to 7 years old. They were spared only because the killers believed they were too young to remember, too young to testify, too young to pose a threat. That calculation was both cold and practical. Children that young might not be able to describe faces or recall names. They might not understand what had happened well enough to explain it to authorities. They could be controlled, molded, taught to believe whatever story they were told. These children were rounded up and taken to different Mormon homes throughout the area. Families who had just participated in murdering the children's parents now took those orphans into their own houses. Some of these families treated the children kindly, as well as anyone could treat a traumatized child whose entire family had just been slaughtered. Others treated them as servants, as burdens, as living reminders of terrible guilt that they tried to suppress. The children were told lies from the start. They were told that Indians had killed their families. They were told that Mormon settlers had rescued them. They were told to be grateful to the people who had taken them in. Some of the children were young enough to eventually accept these lies. Others, the older ones, remembered fragments of truth that contradicted the official story. They remembered white men, not Indians. They remembered people who looked like their neighbors, spoke English, wore regular clothes. But every time they mentioned these memories, they were corrected, told they were confused, told to forget. News of the massacre eventually reached federal authorities, but it took time. The massacre happened in September 1857. Or it was not until the following spring that a U.S. Army officer named Brevet Major James Henry Carleton arrived at Mountain Meadows to investigate. What he found horrified him. Bones scattered everywhere, skulls with bullet holes, evidence that bodies had been left unburied for months while animals and weather did their work. Carleton ordered what remained of the bodies collected and buried properly. His men gathered bones and fragments from across the meadow. They built a cairn, a stone monument, over the mass grave. They placed a wooden cross on top with the inscription, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." It was a clear accusation, a statement that whoever did this would face divine justice even if they escaped earthly punishment. But Carleton could not get anyone to talk. When he interviewed local Mormon settlers, they all told the same story. Indians did it. The Paiutes were to blame. No white men were involved. It was a tragic attack that the Mormons had tried to prevent, but arrived too late to stop. The story was neat, consistent, and completely false. But with everyone sticking to the same lies, Carleton had no way to prove otherwise. The Paiutes themselves told a different story. When asked about the massacre, they said yes, some of their warriors had participated, but they had been recruited and led by white men. They said Mormon settlers had convinced them that the emigrants were enemies who had poisoned springs and needed to be attacked. They said the white men had done most of the killing, but their testimony was dismissed. In the 1850s, white authorities rarely believed Indians over white settlers, and especially when the white settlers were all telling the same coordinated lie. The surviving children became pawns in a larger struggle. Federal authorities wanted them returned to their relatives in Arkansas. Mormon authorities wanted to keep them, both to control what they might say, and because returning them would mean admitting that someone had taken them in the first place, which contradicted the story that the children had been found wandering after an Indian attack. Eventually, after months of legal wrangling, most of the children were sent back to Arkansas to live with extended family. But the damage was done. These children had been traumatized, orphaned, lied to, and then uprooted again from the only homes they had known for over a year. Some of them carried memories of the massacre that would haunt them forever. One little girl remembered men shooting her mother. A boy remembered hiding under a bush and watching people he recognized from earlier in the journey doing the killing. These memories persisted despite all attempts to suppress or deny them. The children's return to Arkansas made headlines. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Questions were asked in Washington. Pressure mounted for a real investigation, for someone to be held accountable, for justice to be served. But in Utah Territory, the walls of silence held firm. The cover-up was massive and coordinated. It involved church leaders, local officials, militiamen, their families, and entire communities. Everyone who knew the truth was bound by threats, by religious loyalty, by fear of what would happen if they talked. And the truth was that dozens of people knew. You cannot murder 120 people with 50 or 60 participants and keep it completely secret. The knowledge spread through communities like poison, but knowing something and talking about it are two different things. In the Mormon settlements of southern Utah, there was tremendous pressure to stay silent. People who raised questions were warned. People who showed sympathy for the victims were shunned. People who suggested that maybe white men, not Indians, had done the killing were threatened with violence or excommunication from the church, which in that time and place meant losing everything: your community, your livelihood, your social standing, possibly even your family. Church leaders worked to suppress the truth. They collected affidavits from participants swearing that Indians had been responsible. They coordinated testimonies so everyone told the same story. They hid documents that might contradict the official narrative. When Mormon leader Brigham Young was questioned about the massacre, he claimed ignorance, said he had no knowledge of white men being involved, suggested it was indeed a tragic Indian attack that his people had tried to prevent. Whether Brigham Young actually ordered the massacre or knew about it beforehand remains debated by historians. Some evidence suggests he sent messages telling his followers not to interfere with wagon trains. Other evidence suggests local leaders misinterpreted or ignored those instructions. What is certain is that after the massacre, Young participated in the cover-up, he protected the guilty, he helped maintain the lies, he used his authority to keep people silent. Federal investigators kept trying to break through the wall of silence but got nowhere. Witnesses who might have talked were intimidated. Evidence disappeared. Documents went missing. The stolen property from the wagon train had been distributed among so many families that tracking it all was impossible. Cattle with the emigrants' brands showed up in Mormon herds, but when asked about it, settlers claimed they had bought the animals from Indians or found them wandering. One investigator reported being followed everywhere he went, being watched constantly, finding that no one would speak to him honestly. He wrote that the conspiracy of silence was so complete it seemed like the entire population was involved. He was not wrong. Entire towns were complicit. Judges were complicit. Law enforcement was complicit. The territorial government was complicit. Everyone had decided that protecting their community mattered more than justice for the dead. The years passed. 1858, 1859, 1860. The massacre faded from national attention as other crises took over. The Civil War erupted in 1861, and suddenly no one in Washington had time to worry about what happened to a wagon train in Utah Territory 4 years earlier. The people of Mountain Meadows were forgotten by everyone except their families in Arkansas, who never stopped demanding answers, never stopped asking who had murdered their loved ones, never stopped pushing for someone to be held accountable. In the settlements where the killers lived, life went on. Men who had participated in the massacre continued farming, raising families, serving in church positions. Some became community leaders, and some prospered using the wealth they had stolen from the dead. They went to Sunday services and sang hymns. They blessed their children and told them to be good people. They lived normal lives while carrying the secret of what they had done. But some of them could not live with it. Some men reportedly suffered nightmares, saw the faces of the people they had killed, heard the screams. Some turned to alcohol. Some became withdrawn and depressed. A few allegedly confessed to family members in private moments, admitting what they had done and begging forgiveness. But those confessions never made it to authorities. They stayed within families, whispered secrets that everyone agreed should never be spoken aloud. The conspiracy held for almost 20 years. 20 years of lies, threats, silence, and collective guilt. But eventually, odd cracks started to appear. In the 1870s, federal authorities renewed their investigation into Mountain Meadows. The political situation had changed. Utah Territory was pushing for statehood, but the federal government made it clear that statehood would not happen while the massacre remained unsolved and unpunished. Pressure mounted. The conspiracy of silence faced its greatest threat yet. Investigators arrived with more resources and more determination than before. They interviewed survivors. They tracked down the children who had been orphaned and were now teenagers or young adults. They examined the physical evidence that still remained at Mountain Meadows. They followed the trail of stolen property. And slowly, painfully, they began to piece together what really happened. Some participants started to break. Under pressure, at facing potential prosecution, some men decided that saving themselves mattered more than protecting the group. They gave statements. They named names. They described the planning, the attack, the massacre, the cover-up. Each confession led to more evidence, more pressure on others to talk, more cracks in the wall that had held for so long. The church faced a terrible choice. They could continue denying everything and risk Utah never becoming a state, or they could offer up a sacrifice, find someone to blame, pin the massacre on a limited number of individuals rather than admitting the broader conspiracy. They chose the latter. They needed a scapegoat, someone they could throw to the federal authorities to satisfy the demand for justice while protecting the larger community. John D. Lee became that scapegoat. He was one of the main organizers of the massacre, so his guilt was undeniable. But he was also someone the church leadership could afford to lose. He had multiple wives at a time when the federal government was cracking down on polygamy. He had fallen out of favor with some church leaders. He was useful as a sacrifice. The narrative shifted. Lee had acted on his own authority. Lee had misunderstood orders. Lee was responsible, and other participants had only followed his lead. This new story was still a lie, but it was a more acceptable lie. It gave authorities someone to prosecute while allowing the church to claim that the massacre was the work of a few rogue individuals rather than a coordinated church action. Lee was arrested in 1874, 17 years after the massacre. His trial became one of the most closely watched in American history. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The Mormon jurors refused to convict. They still held to the code of silence, still believed that protecting one of their own mattered more than justice. But the federal government was not giving up. They pushed for a second trial with a different jury composition. The church, desperate to move forward with statehood, applied pressure on Lee to accept his role as the designated scapegoat. The second trial in 1876 resulted in a conviction. Lee was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. He knew he was being sacrificed. He knew that dozens of other men were just as guilty, but would never face punishment. In his final days, he wrote a confession detailing what really happened, naming participants, or describing the planning and cover-up. He wanted the truth known, even if justice would never fully be served. Lee chose to die by firing squad, which was his right under Utah law. He selected the location for his execution, asking to be shot at Mountain Meadows itself, the site of the crime. On March 23, 1877, nearly 20 years after the massacre, John D. Lee sat on his coffin facing a firing squad. He looked out across the meadow where 120 people had been murdered. He said his final words, proclaiming that he was being sacrificed to save others who were equally guilty. Then the shots rang out. Lee fell dead, the only person ever executed for the Mountain Meadows massacre. His death satisfied federal authorities enough that Utah was finally granted statehood in 1896. But his execution was not justice, it was political theater. One man dead, while dozens of other killers lived free, died peacefully in their beds, and were buried in church cemeteries as respected community members. Lee's execution did not end the cover-up. It just changed its form. For decades afterward, the church worked to minimize what had happened, to control the narrative, to suppress evidence that contradicted their preferred version of events. Church historians wrote accounts that downplayed Mormon involvement. Official church publications either ignored the massacre entirely or presented it as a tragic misunderstanding carried out by a few individuals acting without authority. Documents were hidden or destroyed. Church records that might have shown communication between local leaders and Salt Lake City about the massacre disappeared. Diaries kept by participants vanished, or letters were burned. The institutional church made a deliberate effort to erase as much evidence as possible to make sure that future generations would not fully understand what happened or how many people were involved. Descendants of the killers lived with complicated legacies. Some families knew the truth and carried the shame privately. Others genuinely did not know that their grandfathers or great-grandfathers had participated in mass murder. When the truth came out, as it sometimes did through family research or historical investigation, it devastated people who discovered that their respected ancestor was actually a killer who had escaped justice. The victims' descendants never stopped seeking full acknowledgement. Families in Arkansas and elsewhere kept the memory alive, passed down the story of their murdered relatives, and demanded that the truth be told. They built memorials. They wrote books. They lobbied for official recognition of what had really happened. For over 100 years, they fought against denial and minimization. The church's official position evolved slowly over the decades. By the mid-1900s, they acknowledged that Mormons had been involved, but still tried to limit culpability to a small number of individuals. They claimed that church leadership had no knowledge or involvement, that this was a local action taken by paranoid settlers during a time of crisis. They expressed regret for the tragedy, but stopped short of full accountability. Historians who tried to research the massacre faced obstacles. Church archives restricted access to relevant documents. Researchers who published findings that contradicted official narratives were criticized or had their church membership threatened. The institutional desire to protect the church's reputation remained stronger than the commitment to historical truth for far too long. But the truth has a way of surviving suppression. Archaeological work at the site uncovered more evidence. Bullets were found, bones were examined, and the physical evidence contradicted the sanitized versions of events. Academic historians, both Mormon and non-Mormon, began publishing more accurate accounts based on primary sources and survivor testimony. The Internet age made it impossible to control information the way the church had in previous generations. Survivors' accounts, particularly from the orphaned children who were old enough to remember, and provided devastating contradictions to the official story. These people had been there. They had seen white men, not Indians. They had recognized their attackers as the same people who later claimed to be rescuers. Their testimonies, recorded in affidavits and court documents, could not be erased no matter how much institutional pressure was applied. Some descendants of participants broke family silence and revealed what they knew. One woman discovered her great-grandfather's diary describing his participation in the massacre. She struggled with whether to make it public, knowing it would tarnish her family name. Eventually, she decided that truth mattered more than protecting reputation. The diary was published and provided new details about the planning and execution of the crime. By the late 20th century, the weight of evidence had become overwhelming. Too many documents had survived, too many testimonies had been recorded, too many researchers had dedicated their careers to uncovering the truth. The massacre could no longer be explained away as a simple misunderstanding or blamed entirely on a few rogue individuals. September 11th, 2007. Exactly 150 years after the massacre, representatives from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stood at Mountain Meadows alongside descendants of the victims. It had taken a century and a half, but finally there was an official acknowledgement. Church President Gordon B. Hinckley gave a speech expressing regret for the massacre and condemning the actions of those who carried it out. It was an important moment, but for many descendants it felt incomplete. The speech acknowledged that the massacre happened and that Mormons were involved, but it still emphasized that local leaders acted without authority from church headquarters, still maintained that this was not representative of Mormon doctrine or values, still stopped short of full institutional accountability for the cover-up that lasted decades. A memorial had been built at the site, a stone monument with the names of all 120 victims carved into granite, a place for families to visit, to mourn, to remember. The meadow itself remains much as it was in 1857, a peaceful valley that holds terrible history beneath its grass. Visitors who go there today describe it as haunting, beautiful, and sad, a place where you can almost feel the weight of what happened. Archaeological investigations in 1999 uncovered more remains of the victims. Bones were found with evidence of violent trauma, bullet holes in skulls, cut marks on bones suggesting mutilation, children's bones mixed with adults. The physical evidence confirmed the horror that written accounts had described. These remains were eventually reburied with proper ceremony attended by descendants who finally got to lay their ancestors to rest with dignity. Modern historians have produced detailed, accurate accounts of the massacre based on decades of research. Books like Blood of the Prophets by Will Bagley and The Mountain Meadows Massacre by Ronald Walker, Richard Turley, and Glenn Leonard examined every available piece of evidence and reconstructed events with brutal honesty. These works made it impossible to continue denying what happened or who was responsible. The church eventually opened some of its archives to researchers, though questions remain about whether all relevant documents have been made available. What has been released confirms that church leaders knew far more than they admitted for over a century. Communication between local and church leadership shows awareness of the crime and participation in the cover-up, even if direct orders for the massacre cannot be definitively proven. For descendants on both sides, victims and perpetrators, the massacre remains a wound that never fully heals. Families of the murdered carry the grief across generations. They visit the memorial. They tell the stories to their children. They fight to keep the memory alive so that the victims are not forgotten, so that this crime is not minimized or erased from history. Descendants of the killers face different struggles. Some have embraced the truth and expressed sorrow for what their ancestors did. Others resist, still believing or wanting to believe that the official church narratives were true, that their grandfathers were good men caught in impossible circumstances. Accepting that your ancestor was a mass murderer is not easy, even when the evidence is overwhelming. The land where crushed Texas briefly existed is just empty prairie now. But Mountain Meadows is different. It is marked, remembered, consecrated by memorials and ceremonies. The state of Utah designated it as a historic site. The federal government recognizes its significance. And while it took far too long, there is now official acknowledgement that this massacre happened, that it was wrong, and that the victims deserve to be remembered. But acknowledgement is not the same as justice. Most of the killers died peacefully, never punished, never held accountable. The conspiracy of silence protected them in life and in death. Their graves are in church cemeteries, marked with loving epitaphs that make no mention of what they did. Only John D. Lee paid with his life, and even he was eventually reinstated to full church membership decades after his execution, his name cleared in a way the victims never experienced. So what do we learn from Mountain Meadows? What lessons can we take from this dark chapter of American history? The easy lesson is that fanaticism leads to atrocity, that when people become so convinced of their righteousness that they dehumanize others, terrible things become possible. That fear and paranoia can turn ordinary people into killers. And these are important lessons, but they are not the only ones. The harder lesson is about truth and accountability. Mountain Meadows teaches us that covering up a crime can be as damaging as the crime itself. The massacre killed 120 people in September 1857. But the lies and denials that followed wounded countless others for generations. Families denied closure, communities poisoned by shared guilt, institutions corrupted by the need to protect their reputation at the expense of truth. Think about the children who survived. They lived their whole lives with fragmented memories of horror, told they were wrong about what they remembered, taught to be grateful to the people who destroyed their families. Some of them died never knowing the full truth. Others learned it too late to find real peace. The cover-up victimized them again and again across decades. Think about the participants who did not want to kill but were pressured into it by loyalty, fear, or religious obedience. Some of them suffered tremendous guilt. Some became alcoholics or depressives. Some confessed on their deathbeds, seeking forgiveness they could never fully receive. They were victims of the same fanaticism that destroyed the emigrants, just in a different way. Bad leaders, bad decisions, and group pressure turned them into murderers and then forced them to live with it in silence. Think about future generations who inherited this legacy. Descendants who discovered their respected ancestor was a killer. Families torn apart by whether to acknowledge the truth or protect the family name. Communities divided between those who wanted full disclosure and those who wanted to continue minimizing what happened. The massacre cast a long shadow that still affects people today. The conspiracy of silence at Mountain Meadows worked for a long time. It protected the guilty. It advanced institutional interests. It allowed Utah to achieve statehood. But it failed at the one thing truth always wins eventually: permanence. You can suppress facts temporarily. You can intimidate witnesses. You can destroy documents. You can control narratives for decades. But you cannot erase truth completely. Someone will remember, someone will talk, evidence will surface, and eventually the lies collapse under their own weight. This is not just a story about the Old West, and it is a story about what happens when institutions prioritize reputation over accountability, when communities value loyalty over justice, when individuals choose comfort over truth. These patterns repeat throughout history. Different contexts, different crimes, but the same fundamental choice between acknowledging wrong and covering it up. Mountain Meadows reminds us that there are fates worse than being punished for your crimes. Being celebrated despite your crimes is worse. Dying peacefully while your victims lie in unmarked graves is worse. Passing your guilt to your children and grandchildren who inherit shame they did not earn is worse. The massacre itself was evil, but the century and a half of denial that followed may have done even more damage to the human spirit. The meadow is still there. You can visit it. Stand where families camped, where they were betrayed, where they died. The grass still grows, the spring still flows, birds sing, the sun shines. Nature does not care about human tragedy. But we should care. We should remember not to glorify the past or sensationalize the horror, but to learn, to recognize the warning signs, to value truth over comfort, to understand that silence in the face of evil makes us complicit. 120 people were murdered at Mountain Meadows because ordinary people made terrible choices driven by fear and fanaticism. The cover-up lasted over a century because institutions chose self-preservation over moral accountability. And we are still reckoning with the consequences of both the crime and the lies that followed. If this story made you think about truth, justice, and the long shadows cast by historical crimes, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Tomorrow we are diving into another shocking piece of frontier history, the town that accidentally started a war by shooting the wrong pig. History is full of moments that test human character, and we are going to explore every one of them together. See you in the next story.